on this Father's Day, whether it is while golfing or grilling, fly fishing, or boating, or just from the comfort of an easy chair. I hope that this work of tying science and faith together might be grounding for you, a way to have your feet planted on the earth. Having your feet planted is, of course, important today because we are talking about geology. Smith and Hutton are considered the fathers of modern geology, appropriate for Father's Day, and so they help us keep our feet planted and, in fact, to consider what might be going on underneath the surface of the earth. The two texts that I chose today seemed very geological. They always help me feel connected to the earth. The first is from Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And the second comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 40. In the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. Please pray with me. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be holy and acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Our understanding of the world, and thus our understanding of God, is influenced by the world around us and the way we read the land. When we look to the stars from our vantage point here on earth, what do we see? And how do we talk about that? Or when we look up at the mountain, what story unfolds for us? How was this mountain made? There's a sense that scientists from centuries ago still speak to us today, just as ancient theologians do. And we wanted to unpack that this summer. Our summer sermon series, Christine and Bill and I are preaching, is on the intersection of faith and science, inspired by John Hott's books, God After Darwin and God After Einstein. And so today we think about God after Smith and Hutton, the fathers of modern geology. I fell in love with geology at Ghost Ranch, but that's not hard to do. You would fall in love with geology if you went there, and you probably fell in love with geology when you went to the Grand Canyon, or you drove up to Mount Rainier, or you skied in the Alps. To fall in love with geology is to fall in love with the world and to fall in love with God. It is to pay attention. It is to look and to wonder and to discover and to see. To fall in love with the earth is to delight in God's creation. In the Brothers Karamazov, you hear this line: love all God's creation, the whole and every grain of sand in it. And geologically speaking, every single grain of sand has something to tell us anyway. Look at Ghost Ranch. The story unfolds immediately. Just one grain of sand and you'll see the white and yellow and pink layer here. All of it is an ancient sand dune, frozen in time, buried by an ocean. Hike up to the edge of that ancient sand dune and you can feel the textured sand. See the wind-blown surface as it was 165 million years ago. In geologic terms, 165 million years is still fairly young, considering geologic time as we know it today goes back some 4.6 billion years. So it's practically impossible to conceptualize the scope of time that you can see here on this landscape. The former president of the Geologic Society, Richard Forte, he is from London, he says that the human species, not just my life and your life, but the entirety of the human race is but a grace note in the long symphony of existence. Or, as John Hott points out, the history of the globe, if it were to be distributed across 30 books, each book telling another chapter by chapter the history of time of this planet, 30 volumes, the human race would be in the very last book, on the very last page, in the very last paragraph. That is how small our timeline has been, this human race, in the scope of geologic history. And so, no wonder the psalmist asks, "What are human beings that you are mindful of them, O Lord?" What are human beings that you are mindful of them? We are grounded in God, and yet our feet are planted in the here and now, grounded in an ever more ancient God. But we've not always thought about time this way. This incomprehensible time scale on the level of billions of years was not always the norm. There was a time when scholars believed the earth was only 6,000 years old. In fact, it was James Ussher, not that Usher, this Usher, who declared, who researched heavily and made it his thesis that the earth came into existence on October 23rd, 4004 BC. And I love this. It's precise, it's certain. October 23rd, the day creation became, 4004 BC. And it's not like Ussher just pulled that number out of a hat. He was part of a community of scholars researching this question of origins and beginnings of the history of the earth and wondering where it all began. He followed the best scholarship of his day. He read across disciplines. He searched ancient documents newly made available to him by the Gutenberg Press. And he was supported by a community of scholars. It wasn't magical thinking, it was ancient wisdom. By the 1700s, Ussher's ancient dating of ancient days was not just accepted as the norm, but it was printed in the margin of the King James Bibles, distributed worldwide. And in fact, that mark, you can't read it at all, but that's where it would be. It says BC 4004. So this is Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God, 4004 BC. And it was printed like this in Bibles in the 1700s, all the way up until today. In the years that the Gideons were passing out Bibles, all the way until the 1980s, any Bible that you picked up in a hospital or in a hotel was this edition with the 4004 down the column, and then you could read through the entire Bible, every section having a different year. And it wasn't until the 80s that the Gideons stopped printing this timeline in their Bibles. A friend of mine from college, Bonnie, this beautiful blue-eyed Bonnie, who I had a number of classes with, she told me that the earth was 4004, was created in 4004 BC. So it's not unheard of that you might meet somebody who still follows this timeline that was created in the 1600s. So scientists in the 1700s, as geology is being born, as people are studying the earth, in the same way that a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water, the geologists didn't think that they could be swimming in a timeline that was billions of years old. This was the accepted chronology. Anyone trained at Oxford or Cambridge, for example, would have been trained in chemistry or biology by men who were ordained clergy, and 2/3 of students would have been planning to become clergy themselves. There was not a realm of science and a realm of religion. The pursuit of God and the pursuit of what it meant to be a person of faith pushed the scientists out to discover what was going on under the ground. Scientists were people of faith. They were in the realm of natural history, maybe what we would call proto-geology, and they were researching Noah's flood, thinking that searching the fossil records and collecting specimen would help them to understand more about this ancient biblical story. Noah's flood was a normative, singular event, and the accepted idea at the time was that fossils were remnants of creatures killed during the deluge. So this is the context in which modern geology is born. Here enters James Hutton. He was born in 1726, and he spent his early years as a perpetual student. Maybe you know someone like this. He was a little adrift. His parents had plenty of money, so they sent him to school to study medicine and then chemistry. He went to university in Edinburgh and Paris and Holland, and finally he returned home to run the family farm. And there were so many different new inventions in his day and age that his scientific knowledge was very useful on the farm. There was new farming equipment. There were new ideas like crop rotation and selective breeding that made for a kind of agricultural revolution. So he was in the right place at the right time, but it was walking the earth, spending time on the farm, and observing the land that really opened up Hutton's eyes to this field of geology. He watched the way water slowly eroded the landscape on the farms, taking soil and sediment from one place to another, and he observed the slope of the stones and the angles and the repetition and the predictability of the earth. He was grounded in God, and his feet were planted on the earth, and that opened him to another way of seeing the world. And finally, in 1788, Hutton, taking two friends with him, an older scholar and a younger scholar, they went out in a boat along the landscape of the Scottish coastline, and he was looking specifically for a place where you could tell that the earth was one layer on top of another. And he came to this place. Here's where he came. It was Sycamore Point, and he saw, in a way that no one ever had really thought about, this gray sandstone is standing straight up, and the red sandstone is coming across in such a way that you could tell that the gray sandstone was older. It had been slanted by metamorphic and processes, and then cut across by time and weathering, and then a sea developed and left all this sediment of red stone on top of it. And no one had really thought about geologic time in this way. This can't happen in 6,000 years. This can't happen between 4004 BC and the time Hutton is standing there. This is, for him, a revelation, a holy ground, a place where he is seeing the world afresh and anew, and he is thinking, there has to have been more time. The world is older than we thought. And so he says that the world is immeasurably ancient and indefinitely old. And his friend who's there with him says, the mind seems to grow giddy by looking so far into the abyss of time. It's as if he's looking across all that God has made and sees that it is deeper and wider and farther and broader than he could have ever imagined. And so here he's grounded, both in the presence of God and in this long history, this long story of the earth, which he proposes has no vestige of beginning and no prospect of an end, because it's hard to imagine 4.6 billion years. The time scale is so huge, he can hardly imagine it. So nobody really takes him seriously, right? He's a scientist, his ideas are out there, there's other competing possibilities, and several decades go by, and William Smith enters the scene. He's a canal builder. He, unlike Hutton, does not come from a wealthy family. His father dies when he's 7 years old, and he goes to work for the canal building industry. The canals in England are taking coal here and there, and they're just really changing the landscape of England. And so Smith travels 6,000 miles via canal around the whole of England as a surveyor. And day after day, canal after canal, Smith sees the earth cut into like a birthday cake, revealing the layers, such that after some time, Smith begins to predict with frightening accuracy exactly what layer will be seen before anyone cuts into the earth. And he begins to build a map, not of what is on top of the earth, but what is underneath, what the layers look like, piece after piece, era after era. And he does this, this is something that's never been done before. This is a brand new thing. And he shows this side view as if cutting into all of England from Snowdon to London so that you can see exactly what's happening under the surface. And this is when geology is born, because finally people start listening to him. So what happens when you can see the earth not as this instantaneous creation created once and for all at the beginning of time on October 23rd, 4004 BC? What happens when the time scale is beyond comprehension? One of the things that happens is that Darwin, who soon goes across the ocean on his ship, can begin to imagine the possibilities of species developing over an infinitely broad time scale. So without Hutton and Smith, we don't get Darwin. And so this geological breaking open of time, what they call deep time, makes Hutton and then Smith lifelong, unnoticed partners in our understanding of the very foundations of the world. It makes me wonder, in part, if the ancient prophet Isaiah saw a kind of deep time himself when he writes, "Every valley shall be raised up, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the rough ground level, and the ragged places plain." The geologists say the same thing. Like Isaiah, geologists see valleys being raised up by earthquakes and plate tectonics, and the rough ground is made plain by the weathering of water and wind. There is, they say, a sermon in stone. We can be grounded by the study of the earth. Or as Jesus says, even the stones cry out. Growing up in a world shaped by Hutton and Smith's ideas has contributed to my spiritual formation in ways I can hardly begin to unpack. Maybe that's true for you. Theologian and scientist Thomas Berry puts it this way. He says, "The divine, our God, communicates to us primarily through the language of the natural world. Not to hear the natural world is not to hear the divine." So what Hutton and Smith were doing is holy work, setting us on a path to stand on holy ground ourselves. I myself had a visceral reaction to Mount Rainier, for example, when I went there in high school, this ancient mountain rising above me, such that my voice instinctively sang Psalm 121. I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Mount Rainier, it turns out, this mountain, it's really a baby mountain. It's only 500,000 years old. It's relatively young, but it's still infinitely older than the psalmist who spoke those words. So it's really when we sit on the lakeshore of Lake Michigan, this is the time when we can keep company with the 1.2 billion year history of our lake and our land. There was a mid-continental rift that created this whole place where we are, and ancient Precambrian oceans and glacial sculpting. It is, the geology allows us to be in awe, to hold our life in a gentle way and to pay attention. As Mary Oliver says, "Let me keep company always with those who say, 'Look,' and laugh in astonishment and bow their heads." There's something about being in awe that makes us turn to prayer. To feel the long, storied history of the planet is to be in touch with the presence of God who has hovered over it all. So too, Simon Vail says, attention, taken to its highest degree, is the same thing as prayer. So may our study of the earth and our paying attention to it be akin to prayer, a way to awaken to the Spirit of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen.